Hello, everyone. My name is Edwin Ng, Principal at the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, and welcome to the introductory webcast to IPSAS 51, Tangible Natural Resources Held for Conservation. This webcast will provide background information on the IPSASB's Natural Resources Project, which led to the approval of IPSAS 51, as well as a brief introduction to the guidance and final standard. You can also find the at-a-glance summary of IPSAS 51 on the IPSASB's website at www.ipsasb.org. Before diving into IPSAS 51, it will be important to briefly talk about the evolution of the Natural Resources Project. Prior to the issuance of IPSAS 51, there was no explicit guidance on natural resources in the IPSAS standards or any other international accounting framework. So natural resources were typically not reported in the general purpose financial statements. Because of this lack of reporting, constituents have noted that governments often have little idea of the monetary value of the resources until they are extracted, often by third parties. It was also noted that the reporting of natural resources is important as it provides information to improve management of these resources from both a fiscal and environmental sustainability perspective. Based on this initial feedback, the IPSASB proposed to include a natural resources project in its 2018 strategy consultation, and constituents strongly supported the development of financial reporting guidance on natural resources. As a result, the IPSASB committed to developing financial reporting guidance on natural resources and began the Natural Resources Project in March 2020. At this stage, constituents also provided the IPSASB with feedback that the development of guidance for tangible natural resources, such as minerals, petroleum deposits, water, or living resources, was a greater priority than intangible natural resources. The IPSASB also noted that the accounting issues surrounding the use of intangible natural resources are more in line with the accounting for intangible assets, which was already covered by an existing IPSAS. As a result, the IPSASB decided to focus on tangible natural resources in this project. In May 2022, the IPSASB issued the consultation paper, Natural Resources. This paper sets out the IPSASB's preliminary thinking on whether natural resources can be recognized as assets in accordance with the principles in its conceptual framework. Many respondents generally agreed with the IPSASB's preliminary view that the recognition of natural resources based on a conceptual framework is possible, but noted that in practice, recognition may only be viable in very limited circumstances. The consultation paper also considered the recognition of subsoil resources before extraction, but the IPSASB received strong feedback against the recognition of these items as they do not meet the definition of an asset in the current conceptual framework. Specifically, the existence uncertainty from unextracted resources prevents these items from being considered assets within the IPSASB's conceptual framework. The consultation paper also provided a preliminary description of natural resources, which considered the concept of human intervention, but constituents strongly pushed back due to the difficulties in determining what is actually considered human intervention. Nevertheless, considering the original aim of the project, the IPSASB decided in March 2023 to proceed with the development of an exposure draft on the accounting for tangible natural resources. This exposure draft was approved in September 2024 as Exposure Draft 92, Tangible Natural Resources, and had a comment period ending in February 2025. The proposed guidance was applicable to tangible natural resources which were not already within the scope of an existing IPSAS standard. Because of the scoping approach, ED 92 was proposed to be a residual standard. In response to ED 92, respondents did not agree with the proposed residual scoping approach. Most respondents noted that other than conservation, They were not aware of any other uses of tangible natural resources that did not already fall within the scope of an existing IPSAS standard. Based on this feedback, the IPSAS further refined the scope of the final standard to only focus on tangible natural resources held for conservation, and this led to the development of IPSAS 51, which was approved in December 2025. So what is addressed by IPSAS 51? The purpose of IPSAS 51 is to provide guidance on the recognition, measurement, presentation, and disclosure of tangible natural resources held for conservation. This guidance is based on the principles from the IPSAS's current conceptual framework. IPSAS 51 was not meant to reopen the fundamental concepts within the framework. That is, the standard does not change the definition of assets or how they are recognized within the IPSAS standards. IPSAS 51 was also not meant to provide guidance on how to use the resulting financial reporting data to manage or develop policies on tangible natural resources held for conservation. And it is also not meant to provide guidance on environmental sustainability matters. Based on the change in scope to focus on conservation, to be within the scope of IPSAS 51, an item needs to meet the definition of a tangible natural resource held for conservation. When the IPSAS developed the definition, the board noted that the key characteristics of the assets within the scope of this IPSAS standards include that the item is naturally occurring, it embodies service potential, it has physical substance, and it is held for conservation. Based on these characteristics, the IPSAS decided that a tangible natural resource held for conservation is to be defined as a naturally occurring tangible asset that is managed to prevent its degradation. In addition to the new definition, the IPSAS also added application guidance to explain that conservation and preservation generally refer to the same concept, but the IPSAS chose conservation based on existing definitions used by a number of international and government organizations. Conservation could achieve the objectives of a public sector entity and result in perceived cultural or ecological value to its citizens in current or future generations. This could lead to asset recognition even if no cash flows or future economic benefits are expected from conservation, as it provides service potential to the entity. The application guidance also explains that degradation in the context of conservation is generally considered to be the decline in the quantity or quality of a resource. Finally, the application guidance also explains that some heritage assets are not considered within the scope of IPSAS 51, as they are not both naturally occurring and held for conservation. As mentioned earlier, to be within the scope of IPSAS 51, an item must meet all aspects of the definition of a tangible natural resource held for conservation. Some naturally occurring items may meet the definition of an asset, but if they are held primarily by an entity for purposes other than conservation, they are not within the scope of this standard. Similarly, some assets are held for conservation, but they are not naturally occurring, and these items are also not within the scope of IPSAS 51. So before we move on, here are some examples on what is considered to be within the scope of the standard. The first example is a conservation area consisting of land and plant species. In this case, it is likely that these items are assets within the scope of this standard if they are controlled as a result of past events. The second example are geological features used for energy generation. In this case, because the item is not held for conservation, it is not within the scope of IPSAS 51. The next example we have on the slide are plants used as flood control infrastructure. In this case, because these plants are fulfilling the function of infrastructure assets, they are not held for conservation and therefore not within the scope of IPSAS 51. The next example on the slide are heritage assets that are not naturally occurring. And as we mentioned on the last slide, because these are not naturally occurring assets, they are not within the scope of IPSAS 51. The last example on this slide are conserved free-roaming animals. In this case, whether these animals are within the scope of IPSAS 51 really depends on their specific facts and circumstances. Oftentimes, it will be difficult for an entity to demonstrate that they have control over free-roaming animals, and as a result, they may not be able to demonstrate that these animals are tangible assets. In terms of recognition, the guidance in IPSAS 51 leverages the principles from the IPSAS conceptual framework and are consistent with the recognition criteria in the IPSAS standards for other tangible assets. A tangible natural resource held for conservation is recognized if the item embodies probable service potential, is controlled as a result of past events, and can be measured reliably. The criteria now focuses only on service potential, as tangible natural resources held for conservation are not meant to be used or sold for economic benefits. The IPSAS also decided to add specific guidance on the determination of control. This emphasis was not meant to set a higher bar for control over tangible natural resources held for conservation. Rather, the guidance was added because for some resources, the determination of whether control exists may not be as straightforward as the determination for other assets, such as inventory or property, plant, and equipment. The guidance on measurement in IPSAS 51 is very similar to the guidance from IPSAS 45. Upon initial recognition, the measurement of a tangible natural resource held for conservation depends on whether control of the resource was obtained in a transaction in an orderly market. If control was obtained in such a transaction, such as in an exchange transaction in the market, then the asset is recognized at cost. If control was obtained in a transaction or event that is not part of an orderly market, such as the exercise of sovereign rights from transfers or from other non-exchange transactions, then the resource is measured at deemed cost or current value. For subsequent measurement, an entity has the accounting policy choice to measure a tangible natural resource held for conservation at either historical cost or current value, and this election is made on a class-by-class basis. In the context of tangible natural resources held for conservation, current value can only be measured at current operational value, as these items are not held for their financial capacity. IPSAS 51 also has a rebuttable presumption that the assets within the scope of the standard are not depreciated. The application guidance provides factors to consider when assessing whether the asset has an indefinite or finite useful life and provides guidance on when this presumption can be rebutted. Based on the feedback from ED92, and because current operational value is a relatively new concept, the IPSAS developed an example on the measurement of tangible natural resources held for conservation. Specifically, example 3 of IPSAS 51 walks through two approaches that could be used to determine the current operational value of a forested conservation area, in line with the principles of IPSAS 46, measurement. The first approach is the market approach, which uses data from historical purchases of similar land and forested areas held specifically for conservation. While rare, when the IPSAS developed IPSAS 51, there were already some examples of land that was being purchased for the intended purpose of conservation. Similar to the valuation of other assets using the market approach, the value of the asset being valued may need to be adjusted for differences between the characteristics of that asset and the characteristics of the assets from the market data. The second approach is to build up an estimate of current operational value for a conservation area based on the cost to develop a similar asset. While it may be counterintuitive to develop a forested conservation area, IPSAS 46 accepts the use of the cost to develop a similar asset, which in this context would be the cost to acquire and develop the land to host similar flora and fauna species. Such a cost to develop a similar asset could include the purchase price of the land of similar size and condition, as well as the present value of the cost to cultivate and maintain a forest consisting of the similar species of plants and animals in the area. We will now cover the requirements on presentation and disclosure. Consistent with IPSAS 1, IPSAS 51 requires tangible natural resources held for conservation to be presented as a separate line item in the Statement of Financial Position. IPSAS 51 requires the disclosure of qualitative information, such as information on the nature and risk of recognized tangible natural resources held for conservation, as well as quantitative information conveying their effects on the general purpose financial statements. The qualitative requirements include the disclosure of information regarding measurement, such as the model and inputs used to determine a resource's current value. The standard also clarifies that treaties or legislation regarding natural resources, including arrangements with indigenous peoples, could lead to rights and obligations that should be disclosed. IPSAS 51 also includes a disclosure exemption for the disclosure of the location, quantity, and carrying amount of rare or endangered resources, if such disclosures could lead to their further degradation. The determination of what is considered rare or endangered is based on an entity's judgment, but it is also acceptable to base the determination based on designations by third parties. And finally, IPSAS 51 also requires limited disclosures for tangible natural resources held for conservation, which meet the definition of an asset, but could not be recognized as they could not be reliably measured. In terms of effective date, IPSAS 51 is effective for annual financial periods for periods beginning on or after January 1, 2028. Earlier application of the standard is permitted. The standard can be applied on a full retrospective basis in line with the requirements of IPSAS 3, accounting policies, changes in accounting estimates and errors, or it can be applied on a modified retrospective approach, which lets entities recognize only the tangible natural resources held for conservation that meet the recognition criteria on the date of initial application. Under this modified approach, entities will not need to consider any natural resources that were derecognized prior to the application of IPSAS 51. And now we've come to the end of this introduction to IPSAS 51. For more information on IPSAS 51 or on other IPSAS standards and projects, please visit the IPSASB's website at www.ipsasb.org. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.